The town of Oakhaven existed in a perpetual, bitter twilight, a place where the sun had long surrendered to the frost. Here, the biting cold was a mercy, for it preserved the things that the living wished to keep forever. Elias was a man hollowed out by grief, pouring whatever remained of his soul into the melting vats of tallow. His home was a quiet tomb, haunted by the echoing absence of a love stolen prematurely by the winter plague. Unable to bear the agonizing silence, Elias sought comfort among the crooked stones of the parish cemetery. He gathered the forgotten memorial candles, collecting the sacred, discarded wax left to honor the rotting dead. Back in his dreary workshop, he melted the cemetery wax, purifying the sorrow and prayers trapped within the tallow. He constructed a spine of twisted copper and ribs of iron wire, building a foundation for his desperate masterpiece. Layer by delicate layer, Elias poured the hot, golden tallow, sculpting the curves of a face he could never forget. He carved her hollow, sunken eyes with the precision of a madman, chasing the ghost of a memory. He draped her in the rotting, fraying lace of his late wife's wedding gown, dug from the depths of a cedar chest. She was perfectly silent, perfectly beautiful, and utterly devoid of the warmth of life. But Elias was a master of his craft, and he knew that every candle required a flame to fulfill its purpose. Embedded deep within her skull was a solitary wick, woven from the hair of the deceased. As the flame caught, the frozen tallow warmed, and the bride of beeswax slowly blinked her oversized, hollow eyes. Elias wept as he took her stiff, heavy hands, waltzing with his artificial beloved in the freezing, shadowy parlor. She felt cold and unyielding against his chest, yet to his fractured mind it was the warmth of paradise. For months, the brutal winter kept the town frozen in ice, a perfect environment for a woman made of wax. They lived in quiet, melancholic bliss, hiding away from the prying, sunken eyes of the superstitious townsfolk. But the frost was only a temporary visitor, and soon the cruel warmth of spring began its relentless march. To chase away the lingering chill, the townspeople lit massive roaring fires in the cobblestone squares. The radiant heat seeped through the warped floorboards and crooked window panes of Elia's fragile sanctuary. Sitting in her parlor chair, the bride of beeswax wept her very first tear, though not from sorrow. When Elias touched her cheek, his spindly fingers came away slick and golden with her dissolving flesh. The rising heat of the season was slowly, mercilessly dragging her back into the oblivion of formless tallow. Desperate, Elias tried to patch her deteriorating form with cold, hardened scraps from his crooked workbench. But the old wax was lifeless, refusing to bond with the enchanted, burning tallow of her fragile body. He realized with mounting, suffocating dread that graveyard wax could no longer sustain her unnatural existence. To keep her bound to the mortal realm, he required a material far more vital and far more terrible. He needed the living tallow of the warm-blooded townsfolk, harvested fresh from their bones. His first victim was Lord Thistle, a bloated, greedy aristocrat who often wandered the foggy alleys alone after midnight. Elias moved through the mist with the silent, desperate grace of a starving predator. A single, horrifying flash of silver was all it took to extinguish the Lord's arrogant light. In the suffocating darkness of his cellar, Elias rendered the aristocrat down, skimming the precious, macabre fat from the boiling pot. The resulting mixture was a sickeningly pale, pinkish tallow, infused with the stolen vitality of a fresh corpse. He frantically applied the warm, pinkish paste to his melting bride, praying to a god he no longer believed in. To his horrifying delight, the mortal flesh bound perfectly with the graveyard wax, sealing her grievous wounds. For a brief, stolen moment, her oversized, hollow eyes seemed to gleam with a renewed, terrible life. But the seasons were a cruel, unstoppable machine, and summer soon descended upon Oakhaven with a suffocating, unbearable heat. Within days, the bride began to liquefy, her delicate features dripping away into a grotesque puddle on the warped floorboards. Elia's mind snapped entirely, replaced by a singular, bloody obsession to keep her whole. That night, a young milkmaid vanished on her way to the market, her screams swallowed by the thick, indifferent fog. Then, a drunken sailor was dragged into the black waters of the canal, never to surface again. Elia's cauldrons overflowed with the rendered fat of the innocent, a monstrous soup of stolen time. The bride was no longer a pure, golden vision, but a grotesque, mottled patchwork of yellow beeswax and mortal flesh. Yet, fueled by the blood of the slaughtered, she began to walk with a heavy, terrifying independence. The stolen lives trapped within her wax began to assert their own dark desires, hungering for more. In the dead of night, Elias could hear a chorus of muffled, agonizing whispers echoing from her hollow chest. She did not speak, but her rigid, terrifying gestures demanded that the horrific harvest continue without pause. Oakhaven devolved into a state of paranoid hysteria as the disappearances multiplied. Doors were bolted, windows boarded shut, and the streets abandoned entirely to the suffocating night mist. Elias was dying from the toll of his bloody labor, a hollow shell enslaved by his own creation. Then came the hottest night of the decade, a suffocating, windless inferno that gripped the valley. Despite Elias' frantic efforts, the patchwork bride began to rapidly, unstoppably melt before his very eyes. He scoured the locked streets, but the town had hidden away. There was no one left to harvest. With no other options, the starving artist turned his desperate blade upon his own withered flesh. He rendered his own sparse marrow, offering his very essence to sustain the horrifying monster he loved. The new wax was a dark, violent crimson, a horrific stain upon her once pure, golden visage. Driven by fear and the stench of boiling blood, the surviving townsfolk finally cornered the monster. They battered the door with iron axes, screaming for vengeance for their slaughtered kin. Elias stood before his grotesque bride, a bleeding, broken guardian ready to defend his monstrous masterpiece. A single, glowing torch was thrown through the shattered glass, landing directly in a vat of raw tallow. The workshop erupted in an inescapable inferno, the hungry flames devouring the crooked, wax-soaked wooden walls. Trapped in the blazing heat, Elias did not run. He simply pulled his dissolving bride into one final, suffocating embrace. She melted entirely over him, a boiling shroud of graveyard wax, mortal fat, and twisted love. By dawn, the angry flames had died, leaving only the charred, asymmetrical skeleton of the candlemaker's shop. All that remained of Elias and his horrific obsession was a massive, swirled pool of hardened, bloody tallow. The disgusted townsfolk scraped the fused remains from the stones, burying the cursed wax in an unmarked grave. They believed the nightmare was finally extinguished beneath the cold, indifferent earth. But the chilling winds eventually returned, bringing another brutal, freezing winter to the cursed valley. And in the absolute freezing depths of December, the unmarked earth began to crack. From the frozen soil rose a horrific amalgamation of creator and creation, bound forever in hardened, bloody tallow. They had become one single, terrifying monstrosity, immune to the cold and hungry for the warmth of the living. The beast lumbered toward the sleeping houses, drawn by the roaring, vital hearths of the unsuspecting townsfolk. It pressed its horrific, fused face against the frosted glass, watching the soft, warm bodies wrapped in slumber. Locks and bolts were useless against an entity that could seep through the cracks like melting grease. It stood at the foot of their beds, a silent monument to the horrific sins of their forgotten neighbor. When it claimed its victims, it did not use a blade but simply smothered them in heavy, suffocating tallow. The dead were found the next morning, perfectly preserved and encased in thick, impenetrable layers of graveyard wax. By midwinter, the streets of Oakhaven were entirely empty, transformed into an open-air museum of the dead. The mayor, hollowed by fear, knew that no fire or steel could kill what was already melted and dead. In a final, desperate act, he ordered the remaining survivors to barricade themselves inside the stone cathedral. The massive stone sanctuary was freezing, but its heavy iron doors offered a fragile illusion of absolute safety. The amalgamation arrived at midnight, its heavy footsteps halting before the sacred iron gates. Inside, the survivors held their breath, waiting for the devastating blow of the monster's heavy, waxy fists. But the beast did not strike. Instead, it began to liquefy, oozing its gruesome form beneath the iron threshold. Before their terrified eyes, the puddle reformed, the horrific face of Elias and his bride pulling itself from the floor. The sanctuary was no fortress. It was a sealed tomb, and they had locked themselves inside with the devil. The blue flame atop its head flared with a blinding, supernatural intensity, feeding off the overwhelming terror in the room. With a deafening roar, the creature voluntarily detonated, exploding into a tidal wave of boiling, inescapable tallow. The boiling wave washed over the screaming congregation, burying them instantly in a sea of golden, hardening wax. When the terrible silence finally returned, not a single soul remained alive within the frozen, vaulted halls. The town of Oakhaven had been transformed entirely into a flawless, silent monument to one man's unforgiving grief. In the center of the massacre stood a single, peaceful sculpture, the candlemaker and his bride, locked in an eternal embrace. Atop their fused heads, a single, undying blue flame flickered softly, a twisted beacon of their immortal love. Decades passed, and the cursed town of Oakhaven was swallowed entirely by the surrounding, twisted briar woods. Wandering travelers who stumble upon the ruins eventually find their way to the towering stone cathedral. They step inside, marveling at the incredible, horrifying craftsmanship of the silent, frozen congregation. But those who linger too long notice the faint, agonizing whispers echoing from the hollow chests of the statues. And in the deep shadows, the eternal blue flame suddenly flares with a renewed, desperate hunger. For true love is a flame that must be fed, and the tallow maker is always eager for fresh material.